Investment always raises the question of repatriation. And at this juncture, it is our pleasure to invite Dr. A.A.I.N. Wickramasinghe, Director, Department of Foreign Exchange of the Central Bank of Sri Lanka, to give us an overview on repatriation, the policy and facilitation.
Good day, ladies and gentlemen. It gives me a great pleasure to be with you this afternoon at the opening of the first ever virtual investor forum organized by the Board of Investment of Sri Lanka, Colombo Stock Exchange, and the Ceylon Chamber of Commerce on the theme of Invest Sri Lanka, Asia's Next Growth Haven. On behalf of the Central Bank of Sri Lanka, I, Director, Department of the Foreign Exchange, extend a warm welcome to all the participants of this forum. First of all, I would like to extend my sincere gratitude to the official of Board of Investment, Colombo Stock Exchange, and Ceylon Chamber of Commerce for inviting me to deliver the keynote speech on repatriation policy and facilitation consistency of repatriation in line with the existing foreign exchange regulatory framework of Sri Lanka, established under the Foreign Exchange Act No. 12 of 2017. I would begin this speech with few words on the evolution of the foreign exchange regulatory framework in Sri Lanka. Within the lapse of just 5 years of the independence, Sri Lanka enacted the Exchange Control Act in 1953. Under the same regulatory regime, in early 1990s, Sri Lanka totally liberalized cross-border current transactions and considerably relaxed rules and regulations on foreign ownership of equity. The objective of this liberalization was to attract foreign direct investments into Sri Lanka. As a result of the same, Sri Lanka experienced considerable increase in foreign direct investments into many sectors in the country. After almost 64 years from the enactment of Exchange Control Act, in 2017, the government of Sri Lanka decided to introduce a new Foreign Exchange Act with a view to move into a further liberalized foreign exchange regulatory framework. The primary objective of such move was to provide a more investor-friendly and flexible foreign exchange policy to further promote foreign direct investments into the country. The Foreign Exchange Act, on the face of it, has the intention of graduate from a controlling regime to facilitating regime. The preamble of the Act says it is an act to provide for the promotions and regulation of foreign exchange in Sri Lanka. The minister assigned the subject of central bank. In fact, the Minister of Finance at present is vested with the powers and operationalize the provisions of the Act by way of regulations, orders, and directions made and issued. The Central Bank of Sri Lanka, as the agent of the government, is responsible for implementing the provisions of the Act in accordance with the directions of the Minister. As I mentioned to you a short while ago, with the signing up of Article 8 with the IMF in 1994, the current transactions are fully liberalized in Sri Lanka. Actually, the new Foreign Exchange Act has liberalized cross-border capital transactions to a great extent, in line with the foreseen capacity of Sri Lankan economy to maintain the external value of the Sri Lankan rupee. The regulations and orders have been made by the Minister to operationalize the provisions of the Act. Central Bank of Sri Lanka, with the collaboration of the Ministry of Finance, continuously review the applicability or validity of foreign exchange regulations and directions in line with the developments in the domestic and international foreign exchange markets and business environment, and introduce necessary amendments to the regulations. The most recent version of such revisions were made in March this year. Actually, prevailing foreign exchange regulatory framework has paved the way for foreign investors to invest in Sri Lanka and to carry out the related capital transactions, especially for the repatriation of returns and other proceeds of such investments without any restrictions. It is done by way of simplified and clearly defined channels for fund movements through the inward investment account. This was previously known to as the Securities Investment Account. Moving on to investing in Sri Lanka, you could see that the Minister has issued regulations applicable on investments in Sri Lanka by the non-residents. Be more specific, it is the Foreign Exchange Regulations number 2 of 2021, published in the Government Gazette. This regulation number 2 has clearly and comprehensively defined the permitted capital transactions which include foreign investments in Sri Lanka. Further, it defines what are the general permissions for such capital transactions, including applicable limits, exclusions, limitations, terms and conditions, and the procedures to be followed. I suggest and request all the foreign investors to go through these regulations, which are readily available for access in the official website of the Department of Foreign Exchange. That is www.dfe.lk. For the benefit of you joining this graceful occasion, I would like to summarize these investments permitted in Sri Lanka for non-residents at present. Non-residents are allowed to invest in shares of a company incorporated in Sri Lanka. Share investments in both listed and unlisted companies are permitted. Invest in debt securities issued by the companies incorporated in Sri Lanka with a tenure of 3 or more years are also permitted. However, there is no minimum tenure requirement for listed debt securities and debt securities issued by licensed commercial banks, licensed specialized bank, licensed finance companies, or specialized leasing companies in Sri Lanka. Further, you may invest in units in unit trusts or mutual funds, government securities, such as treasury bills, treasury bonds, or any other securities issued by the government of Sri Lanka, and securities issued by the Central Bank of Sri Lanka, state-owned enterprises, or other statutory body of the country. Invest in term deficits in Sri Lanka rupees or any designated foreign currency in licensed financial institutions are also permitted. Further, foreigners could invest in immovable properties, but subject to other applicable laws in the country. The other prominent category of capital transaction in Sri Lanka is loan. As per the prevailing regulations, non-resident lenders are permitted to grant loans with a minimum tenure of 3 or more years to the companies incorporated in Sri Lanka. In addition to that, non-residents are allowed to grant loans to the government of Sri Lanka or state-owned enterprises, licensed commercial banks, licensed specialized bank, licensed finance companies, and specialized leasing companies with the minimum tenure without minimum tenure requirement. Further, in the recent revisions to the foreign exchange regulations, we have introduced a new loan category where the parent company is in overseas is allowed to grant loans to its branch officers or project officers registered in Sri Lanka. Apart from that, I would like to stress on the fact that as per the prevailing regulations, there are no specific restrictions for channeling funds into Sri Lanka in respect of permitted investments to be made by foreign nationals. The only requirement is that the investors have to open inward investment account in order to route the funds into Sri Lanka as a compulsory procedural requirement. An investor could easily open an inward investment account, widely known as IIA, with a bank in Sri Lanka while they being outside Sri Lanka by providing general information and documents required for opening the accounts. I will further elaborate the rationale for introducing inward investment account for investors in a little while. Now, the time has come to move on with my main theme of the day, which is repatriation policy and facilitation consistency of repatriation. As we all are aware, the core principle behind the facilitation of foreign direct investment is that at the end of the day, the respective non-residents should have the ability to freely remit out any income or capital proceeds derived from such investments made in Sri Lanka. Hence, it is our main responsibility and priority is to facilitate a flexible and smooth repatriation procedure for such investors while stimulating the capital creation in the country with such foreign direct investments. In line with that intention to facilitate non-resident investors, the government of Sri Lanka has taken steps to fully transform the repatriation policy, which was previously governed under the Repatriation Control Act, to a relaxed and flexible policy with the enactment of the existing Foreign Exchange Act. Now I should explain why the IIA requirement is important. The inward investment account, which I mentioned a little while ago, has been introduced merely to facilitate foreign investments of non-residents investors in and made outside Sri Lanka. Funds lying in an IIA are free to remit outside country. Accordingly, IIA plays a vital role in the facilitation of foreign direct investments into the country. Importance of IIA procedure is significant when you come to the point of repatriating any returns of the investment. This procedure provides a clear and smooth path for non-residents to route funds into Sri Lanka and to repatriate the returns of the investments and other capital proceeds, including the maturity proceeds of investments. It ensures greater transparency in terms of the transactions between the investor and investee. As all funds are coming through the banking channel, it will work as a tool for compliance to the foreign exchange regulations and other applicable laws. We believe that the transparency and compliance ensured by these procedures enhance the confidence of foreign investors and pave a simple, clear, and most importantly free path to repatriate return of investments and other capital proceeds without restriction and hassle. Talking further benefit about the IIA, these accounts enable the account holder or the investor to keep records on the inward remittances made through the accounts from the very first day to the closure of it. It will ease the hassle of keeping records or evidence on inward remittance. Prospective bank is responsible to manage all the transactions and keeping such records until the time of disposal, maturity, or liquidation of the investment made through the IIA. I would confidently say that you are not required to have any doubt on the security or confidentiality of the investments that you are willing to do in Sri Lanka, due to the fact that banks conduct a thorough due diligence on transactions and ensure the legality and transparency of the inward investments that are routed through Sri Lanka through the banking channel via IIA. Repatriation framework set out by the regulations made under the Foreign Exchange Act has addressed at large every aspect in relation to the repatriation of proceeds investments made in Sri Lanka. Several capital transactions, namely investment in units and granting loans to the government of Sri Lanka and state-owned enterprises, have been exempted from the IIA requirements. In this case, repatriation of returns of such investments may be directly repatriated with the submission of evidence on inward remittances for the investment. Even though the IIA procedure has been deviated in these scenarios, mechanisms are well in place to monitor such transactions. In the event an overseas lender is not willing to open an account in Sri Lanka, the borrower in Sri Lanka may open an account called External Commercial Borrowing Account, which is known as ECBA, with the bank in Sri Lanka to receive the loan proceeds and for the purpose of serving the same. Our policy has addressed not only the current investments but also the past investments made in Sri Lanka by non-residents at the time of these procedures were not in effect. prevailing regulations has clearly established a procedure to facilitate repatriation related to such past investments. Banks have been provided necessary directions to facilitate such transactions through a newly opened IIA after verifying the inward investments for the related investments to their satisfaction. In the event, if no information is available on the past investments, yet non-residents can repatriate their returns or other proceeds of investments subject to certain limits which clearly stipulated in the regulations. In the case of investments which have been inherited or received by way of gift or being settlement under an order by court, such repatriation has been accommodated through an inward investment account opened by the relevant beneficiary. Accordingly, it is clearly evident that each and every aspect of repatriation of returns and other capital proceeds of the investments made in Sri Lanka has been addressed under the foreign exchange regulatory framework in order to facilitate non-resident investments. Especially, we are readily committed and willing to make necessary revisions to the existing framework in line with future developments and requirements of the investors. Stepping into the latter part of this speech today, I am very pleased to inform you that despite all the endeavor to face the challenges of the prevailing pandemic, the Sri Lankan government has not imposed any restriction whatsoever on the repatriation of funds outside Sri Lanka by foreign investors. Especially as the regulator of the foreign exchange affairs in the country, I can ensure that Sri Lanka will not deprive the repatriation rights of investors in future as well. Finally, before winding up my speech today, I would like to say that being a country with strategic geographical placement in the Indian Ocean, well-educated and skilled labor force, and very affirmative policies on investors is a haven for investors all around the world to make their investments. I invite all of you to invest in Sri Lanka and reap the greatest benefit out of the jewel of Indian Ocean while contributing to the development of our beautiful country. I trust that this session will enrich and equip you with useful insights of today's theme, repatriation policy and facilitation consistency of repatriation. Thank you. Have a good day and stay safe.